We've listed the cabin, Dad. Closing's next Friday. You'll want to have your things out of there by then. That was how my daughter told me. Not a phone call. A text. 11 words on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in my kitchen in Sudbury watching the snow come down sideways off Ramsey Lake. The cabin she meant was the place up on Manitoulin, the one her mother and I built with our own hands over 15 summers. And the thing my daughter didn't know, the thing she never once thought to check, was that the land that cabin sits on was never hers to sell. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you how I let her walk all the way to the edge of the cliff before I cut the rope, do me a favor. If you've ever given everything to your kids and watched them treat it like it was nothing, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which province you're watching from. And if you believe a parent's trust should mean something, leave a like. It tells me I'm not the only one. My name is Russell Hargrove. I'm 68 years old, and up until that Tuesday, I thought I'd done right by everybody. I spent 31 years at Inco, came up through the mills, ended as a shift superintendent. Decent pension. Paid off the house on Bessie Avenue years ago. My wife Eileen and I were never flashy people. We drove our cars until the floors rusted out. We took our holidays at the cabin instead of Cuba. We saved. And when Eileen got her diagnosis, the savings turned out to be the only thing standing between us and the kind of fear that eats people alive. She passed 4 years ago this March, pancreatic. It went fast, which the doctor said was a mercy, though it never felt like one to me. After she was gone, I had 2 things left that mattered. One was our daughter, Tessa. The other was that cabin on the North Channel. Let me tell you about the cabin because you need to understand what it was before you understand what it cost them to throw it away. Eileen and I bought the lot in 1989. 2 acres of granite and white pine, right on the water, north shore of Manitoulin, looking out across the channel toward the La Cloche Mountains. We paid $11,000 for it, which was real money for us back then. We didn't have a builder. We had a book from the library and a borrowed cement mixer and a lot of stubbornness. I poured the footings myself. Eileen chinked the logs. It took us the better part of 6 summers before it had a proper roof and a wood stove that didn't smoke us out. Tessa learned to swim off the dock there. We scattered some of Eileen's ashes off that same dock because she asked me to. So when Tessa came to me about 3 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table with that careful voice she uses when she wants something, and said, "Dad, you really should think about putting the cabin in my name, for the taxes, for probate. So it's not a mess later," I believed her. I want you to hear that plainly. I believed my own daughter. Estate planning, she called it. Smart, she called it. She brought a lawyer's letter and some forms with the little colored tabs, showing me where to sign. She told me nothing would change, that it would always be my place, that she just wanted to make things simple when I was gone. I signed. I even thanked her for thinking ahead. What I didn't understand at the time, what I understood very well by the end, is that there's a difference between thinking ahead and lying in wait. Tessa married a fellow named Brett about 8 years ago. He sells cars, or he did, or he says he does. Brett is the kind of man who talks about his next big thing the way other people talk about the weather, constantly and without ever being responsible for it. They live down in Barino, in a house I'm fairly sure they can't afford. And over the years, I'd quietly helped. A few thousand here when the furnace went. Co-signed a vehicle once. Paid for a stretch of Tessa's college that she never finished. I never made a thing of it. That's what fathers do, I told myself. You don't keep a ledger on your own child. I should have kept the ledger. That Tuesday, after the text, I called her. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I sat down at the table where she'd had me sign those papers, and I texted her back, my thumbs slow and clumsy. "Tessa, you can't sell the cabin." That place is your mother's. We need to talk about this. 3 little dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then her reply came through and I read it 4 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Dad, it's legally mine. It's been mine for 3 years. Brett and I need this. The market's good and we're getting out from under some things. There's a unit at the retirement residence in Sudbury I can help you look into. It's actually really nice. I have to go. Things are busy here. We'll talk after closing. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. A retirement residence. She'd already picked one out. My daughter had decided, without asking me a single question, that I would spend the rest of my life in a beige room that smelled of cleaning product, and that the place where her mother's ashes drift in the channel would belong to strangers. And the part that I keep coming back to, even now, is the line, "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." As if I were the one making it hard. As if grief were an inconvenience in her schedule. I put the phone face down on the table. I looked out at the snow. And for a while I didn't feel anything at all, which I've since learned is what happens right before you feel everything. 2 days later, a courier brought an envelope to my door. Inside was a single sheet, a copy of an email that Tessa had sent. Not to me. To everyone. To my brother Doug in Thunder Bay. To Eileen's sister. To the Pratts and the Limnews from church. To people I'd worked with at Inco for 30 years. The subject line read, "An update about Dad," and my stomach dropped before I read a single word of it. She'd written that she was heartbroken to share that I hadn't been doing well, that my memory had been slipping since Mom passed, that I'd been making concerning financial decisions and letting the cabin fall into disrepair, that after talking it over with Brett, they'd made the painful choice to sell the property and move me somewhere I could be properly looked after. And then the part that I will remember on my deathbed. If Dad reaches out to any of you with confused stories about being forced out or asking for money, please be patient with him. The doctors say this kind of paranoia is part of it. We're handling everything. Please respect our privacy during this difficult time. I read it standing in my front hall, with my coat still half on. I want to describe to you what Dad did to me, but I don't have the words for it even now. She hadn't just decided to take the cabin. She decided to take my mind, to pre-poison every person I might turn to, so that if I called my own brother for help, he'd hear me out and think, "Poor Russ, it's the dementia talking." She was building a wall around me before I even knew I needed to climb out. She'd thought of everything, except she hadn't, and that's where his story turns. I stood there in the hall, and somewhere under the grief and the disbelief, something old and cold began to wake up. Tessa knew me as her dad, the retired millwright who putters in the garage and falls asleep in front of the Leafs game by the second period. She knew Russ Hargrove, who fixes the neighbor's snowblowers and brings soup when somebody's sick. That's who she thought she was dealing with. A gentle old man who'd fold. What she'd forgotten, or maybe never really knew, is that for the last 14 years of my career at Inco, I wasn't on the mill floor. I was the one the company sent into rooms with the union and the lawyers when a contract went sideways. I read agreements for a living. I knew where the bodies were buried in every clause, because I was the one who'd helped bury them. I'd negotiated things that decided whether 2,000 families kept their jobs. I knew, better than almost anybody, that the words on a page are not the same thing as the truth of who owns what. And I knew something about that cabin lot that my daughter, in 3 years of feeling like she owned it, had never once bothered to learn. I went to the kitchen, and instead of calling Dud to defend my sanity, I dug out an old address book and found a number I hadn't dialed in close to a decade. A fellow named Wendell Cho, the lawyer who'd handled my and Eileen's affairs back when I was still working. He was semi-retired now, up in a little office in Espanola. He answered on the third ring, And when I told him who it was, he laughed and said it must be serious if Russ Hargrove was phoning a lawyer on a Thursday. "Wendell," I said, "I need you to pull the file on the Manitoulin property, the cabin lot. And I need you to pull the survey and the title history all the way back to '89. There's something in there I need you to look at before you say a word to me about how my daughter just sold it out from under me." There was a pause on the line. "She sold the cabin," he said slowly. "Russell, did she own it?" "She owns the cabin," I said. "She does not own the ground it stands on. And I don't think she has the faintest idea there's a difference." I heard him sit up in his chair. "Come to the office tomorrow. Bring whatever you've got. And Russell, if I'm remembering that file the way I think I am, you'd better sit down before I explain what your daughter just did." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in the recliner with Eileen's picture on my lap, the one from our trip to the zoo for our anniversary. And I talked to her the way I still do. I told her what Tessa had done. I told her about the email, and I told her I was sorry because I knew what I was about to do, and I knew it would mean losing our daughter for good. But I also knew that the woman in that photograph had spent her whole life believing that people had to answer for what they did, even people you love. Especially them. The next morning I drove the hour and a bit to Hispaniola, to country I'd driven 1,000 times, past the rock cuts and the frozen beaver ponds, and I sat across a cluttered desk from Wendell Cho while he laid it out for me with a kind of grim delight that lawyers get when they find a beautiful technicality. Here's what most people don't understand, and what Tessa certainly didn't. When Eileen and I set up our affairs all those years ago, we didn't do the simple thing. On the advice of a sharp young lawyer at the time, we'd separated the property into two pieces. The cabin itself, the structure, we eventually transferred into Tessa's name 3 years ago for exactly the probate reason she talked about. But the land underneath it, those 2 acres of granite, we had never transferred at all. The land was held in a separate arrangement, in a small holding company Eileen and I had created decades ago, of which I was now, since her death, the sole director and shareholder, and the cabin sat on that land under a long-term lease. A 99-year lease would have been ordinary, but that young lawyer, God bless his cautious heart, had structured it differently. The lease ran in 20-year terms, renewable in writing, and the current term, the one that had quietly been ticking down in a filing cabinet for 2 decades, while my daughter played house up there every August, was set to expire at the end of that very month. "Russell," Wendell said, tapping the page, "if this lease isn't renewed before it lapses, there's a reversion clause. Clause 9. On expiry, all improvements on the land, the cabin, the dock, the boathouse, everything affixed to it revert to the landowner, to your holding company, to you, no compensation owed to the leaseholder." He looked up at me over his glasses. "Tessa owns a cabin. But the second that lease lapses, she owns a cabin sitting on land she has no right to occupy, and the cabin itself stops being hers. She has, by my count, about 3 weeks." I sat there for a long moment. Outside the window, a plow went by, scraping the street down to gray. "And the buyers," I said, "whoever she's selling to, their lawyer would catch this. A title search would turn up the holding company, the lease." Wendell shook his head slowly. "A proper one would. But Russell, look at the timeline. She's closing in a matter of days. That's not a careful sale. That's a fire sale. Somebody doing diligence that fast on a recreational property way up on Manitoulin in winter when nobody can even get out to inspect it. They're going to run a standard search on the structure and the obvious parcel. They're very likely going to miss a holding company lease that was registered before half their associates were born." He set down his pen. "The question is what you want to do. We can stop this today. One letter and the sale collapses before it closes. This deal falls apart. She's angry. She calls you confused. Life goes on. Or, I said, or you let it close." I looked at him. He looked at me. "If you let it close," he went on carefully, "she takes their money. She spends it. And when that lease lapses at month's end, she will have sold a property she did not have clear title to and accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. That's not a family squabble anymore, Russell. That's fraud. The buyers will come after her. The Crown might. I can't tell you how that ends, but I can tell you it doesn't end with a beige room in Sudbury for you. It ends with one for her. I thought about the email. If Dad reaches out with confused stories, please be patient with him. I thought about Eileen's ashes in the channel and the developer's dock going in where ours had been. Let it close, I said. Wendell was quiet a moment. Then he nodded, slow, like a man agreeing to something heavier than he'd expected. I'll have my office pull everything and prepare the reversion notice. We file the instant the lease lapses, not a minute before. Until then, we do nothing. We let her believe she's won. He paused. You understand there's no coming back from this. Once that money's spent and the title snaps back, the law takes over and you can't call it off. I understand. She's your daughter, Russell. She was, I said. When she had a choice, she made it. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went about my days. I shoveled the walk. I had coffee at the team's only salle with the same fellows I always do. And the whole time, in the back of my mind, a clock was running that only Wendell and I could hear. Tessa, meanwhile, had no idea. I knew this because she made the mistake of staying just connected enough to gloat. A few days before the closing, she actually called me, and I nearly dropped the phone. Her voice was bright, breezy, the voice of someone who's already spent the money in her head. Dad, I just wanted to check in. I know this has been hard, but I really think once you settle into the new place, you'll see it's for the best. Brett and I are even thinking about taking a trip. Once everything closes, we've been so stressed. I'll send you the brochure for the residence, okay? They have a games room and everything. She actually said games room to me, a man who could still split a full cord of firewood in an afternoon. I told her, in a flat voice she probably mistook for defeat, that she should do what she thought was right. She took it as surrender. I love you, Dad, she said. And the awful thing is she may even have meant it in the small, dishonest way she meant most things. I know you don't get it right now, but you will. I hung up and sat in the quiet. I won't pretend there wasn't a part of me, right up to the end, hoping she'd phone back and say she couldn't go through with it. That she'd remember the dock, the swimming lessons, her mother. That hope is the hardest thing to kill. But she never called back. The closing went through on a Friday. Somewhere down in Barrie, a lawyer's trust account released the funds, and my daughter became, in her own mind, a wealthy woman. I let her have the weekend. Wendell and I had agreed on that. Let her feel it. Let her book the trip. Pay down whatever it was she and Brett were so desperate to get out from under. Because the higher she climbed on that feeling, the further there was to fall. The lease lapsed at midnight on the last day of the month. There was no thunderclap. I was asleep, finally, for the first time in weeks. But somewhere in a registry the ground shifted, and the cabin my wife and I built with our hands stopped belonging to the daughter who'd sold it and came home to me. At 9 the next morning, Wendell filed the notice of reversion. By noon it was done. The cabin, the dock, the boathouse, all of it reverted to my holding company, which meant the property Tessa had sold for, I later learned $410,000, was no longer hers to have sold. She'd taken their money for something that had quietly slipped out of her hands while she slept. I could have let the lawyers handle all of it from a distance. Wendell wanted to, but I needed to be there. I needed to look my daughter in the eye, not out of cruelty, but because Eileen would have wanted one of us to have the decency to face her, and Eileen was gone. The buyers, it turned out, were a numbered company that flipped recreational properties, and they'd wasted no time. The following Saturday, they sent a crew up to the cabin to start clearing it for a rebuild. Wendell got word and we drove out together. Him and me and the fellow named Officer Tremblay from the OPP detachment who Wendell had quietly briefed, because we'd need a witness who understood exactly whose land we'd be standing on. When we came up the long drive through the pines, there were 2 trucks parked by the cabin, and the young foreman barking at a couple of workers who were carrying Eileen's old kitchen table out toward a dumpster. And standing on the porch of all people were Tessa and Brett. They'd driven up from Barrie to watch their investment get clear, I suppose, to say goodbye to the place they'd never really loved. Tessa was in a new coat I didn't recognize, holding a take-out coffee, looking out at the channel as she owned the view. She saw my truck, and her face did something complicated. Confusion first, then irritation. She came down off the porch as I got out. "Dad, what are you doing here? You can't just— this is private property now. You have to." She stopped when she saw Wendell. Then she saw Officer Tremblay, and the color started leaving her face. The foreman walked over, annoyed. "This is a closed site. You folks need to clear out." "I'd shut your equipment off, son," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I'd felt in weeks. "You're about to do a lot of damage to a building that doesn't belong to the people who hired you." Brett stepped up then, doing his salesman thing all chest. "Russell, come on. We did this by the book. Tessa owned it free and clear. We sold it. It's done." "I know it's hard, but you're embarrassing yourself, buddy." I didn't even look at him. I looked at my daughter. "Tessa," I said, "when your mother and I set up the cabin, do you remember signing the structure over into your name? The probate paperwork?" "Yes," she said. "Wary now. What's that?" "You own the cabin," I said. "You never owned the land. 2 acres under it have been held in a company your mother and I built before you were born, and the cabin only ever sat on that land under a lease." I nodded to Wendell, who opened his folder and held out a copy of it, the old pages soft with age. "That lease ran out at the end of last month. There's a clause in it, clause 9, that says, when the lease ends without renewal, everything built on the land comes back to the landowner. The cabin, the dock, all of it. It came back to me at midnight on the 31st. I let that sit. You sold these people a cabin that stopped being yours the week after you signed the papers." The foreman had gone pale and pulled out his phone. Brett was saying something, his voice climbing, but I'd stopped hearing him. I was watching Tessa, watching the brightness drain out of her, until she looked the way she had as a little girl, when she'd done something she couldn't undo. "That's not— you gave it to me," she said. "It's mine. You can't just take." "I didn't take anything," I said quietly. "I just stopped giving." "There's a difference. You spent 3 years feeling like the cabin was yours, and not once did you read what you actually signed. You were too busy deciding I'd lost my mind." Officer Tremblay stepped forward then, and explained to the foreman in plain terms that the site was to be shut down immediately, that the legal ownership of every structure on it was now in dispute and very likely vested in my company, and that anyone who damaged a single board could be held liable. The workers set Eileen's table down in the snow. The trucks went quiet, and in that quiet I heard my daughter start to understand the size of what she'd done. Because here is what she grasps. All at once, standing on the porch of the cabin, her mother chinked by hand. She had taken $400,000 from a company of professional property flippers for an asset she could not legally convey. The cabin had reverted to me. The buyers would want every cent back, and Wendell had already had a call that morning suggesting their lawyers were past wanting it back and well into wanting somebody charged. And the money Brett let slip in his panic was already half gone, swallowed up by whatever hole the 2 of them had been so desperate to climb out of. Tessa came toward me across the snow, and the new coat and the take-out coffee couldn't hide it anymore. She was terrified. Dad, please. You have to fix this. You own the land. You can just renew the lease, can't you? Sign it back into place. Make the sale good." If you do that, they keep the cabin, we keep the money. Nobody has to do that. They're saying fraud. They're talking about charges. Please, I'm your daughter. There it was. I'm your daughter. The card she'd kept up her sleeve the whole time, played only now, only when she was bleeding. And God help me, I felt it. I felt every year of her. The baby I walked the floor with at 3 in the morning. The girl I taught to swim off that dock 20 feet from where we stood. I could have done it. One signature, one lease renewal backdated, and Wendell could probably have made the whole thing whole. I could have taken the loss and let her walk away clean. That's what a father does, isn't it? Falls on the grenade. But I thought about the email. The doctors say this kind of paranoia is part of it. I thought about a beige room with a games room in it that she'd picked out for me before she'd asked me a single question. I thought about Eileen and what it would have done to her to watch our daughter become someone who would write those words about her own father and call it kindness. I could fix it, I said. You're right. One signature and you'd walk away from this. I watched the hope flare in her eyes and I made myself keep going. But I'm not going to. Because 2 weeks ago you didn't have a problem. You needed your dad to fix. 2 weeks ago I was a burden you'd already fired away. You only remember I'm your father when you need one. I stepped back. I'm not going to renew the lease, Tessa. You're going to answer for this. I think it's the first thing in a long time that might actually teach you who you are. She screamed something at me. I don't remember her words, only the sound, the same sound I'd heard her make as a toddler in a tantrum. Except she was 41 years old, and there was a police officer writing down her name. Brett tried to get in his truck and leave, and Tremblay told him plainly he wasn't going anywhere. I turned and walked back through the snow to the dumpster, and I lifted Eileen's kitchen table out of it, the one she'd set 10,000 suppers on, and I carried it back toward the cabin while my daughter wept on the porch. I didn't press my own charges in the end. Wendell wanted me to. The holding company had grounds to sue them into the next century for selling property they didn't own, but I'd had enough. The buyers and the Crown would do what they were going to do, and I didn't need to add my weight to a thing already collapsing under its own. That was the only mercy left in me, and I gave it not for her sake, but for Eileen's, because somewhere in that woman who'd sold our cabin was still the little girl her mother had loved. I keep the cabin now. I went up in the spring once the ice was off the channel, and I sat on the dock where we'd scattered her, and I told Eileen it was done, and that it was ours again, and that it was ours again, and that I was sorry it had to cost what it cost. The crew never came back. The numbered company settled with the holding company and went away. Tessa and Brett are working through what they did in courtrooms a long way from that quiet water, and I don't get updates, and I've made my peace with not getting them. People ask me, the few who know the whole story, whether I'd do it again, whether I could really turn my back on my own child. And I tell them the truth, which is that I didn't turn my back on her. I turned my back on the lie that loving someone means letting them strip you to the bone and thanking them for it. I gave that girl everything I had for 41 years, and the one thing I had left to give her was the consequence she'd spent her whole life being protected from. Maybe it ruins her. Maybe, somewhere down the line, it's the thing that finally wakes her up. I don't know. That part was never mine to control. What I know is this: you can build a person a cabin with your own 2 hands, and it won't make them good. You can hand them the deed to everything you own, and it won't make them love you. The only thing you can't give away, the only thing nobody can take unless you let them, is your own self-respect. I almost let her take mine. I'm glad I didn't. Eileen would have been glad too. The hardest thing I ever had to accept is that you can love someone with everything you've got, and it still won't be enough to make them honest. I gave Tessa 41 years. I gave her the cabin her mother and I built, board by board, the swimming lessons off that dock, the college tuition, the co-signed loans I never once mentioned again. And none of it built the thing I assumed I was building. I thought I was raising a daughter who'd carry our values forward. What I learned, standing in the snow watching a police officer write down her name, is that you can hand a person every advantage and still hand them nothing at all if you never let them feel the weight of their own choices. That's the part I got wrong, and I'll own it. For decades, I confused being a good father with being a soft one. Every time Tessa got herself into a hole, I filled it before she had to look down. I thought I was protecting her. I was actually robbing her of the one teacher that ever really was, which is consequence. By the time she sent that email telling our whole family I'd lost my mind, she'd never once in her life had to answer for anything. So why would she think she'd have to answer for this? The fire that came for her at the end, I didn't light it. She built it herself, one unearned rescue at a time, and I handed her the matches every single one of those times by calling it kindness. What saved me wasn't cleverness, though Lord knows the lease was clever. It was that I finally stopped lying to myself. Sitting up with Eileen's photograph that first night, I made a decision that cost me more than the cabin ever could have, and I made it with a clear head instead of a broken heart. Wendell gave me the legal road, but the courage to walk it had to come from somewhere older than any contract. It came from 40 years of getting up for a shift I didn't feel like working, of doing the right thing when the easy thing was right there. You don't develop that kind of backbone in a crisis. You bring it to the crisis already built, or you don't have it when it counts. So if you take anything from a foolish old man up in Sudbury, take this. Be the kind of person whose word holds, even when nobody's checking, because that's the foundation everything else stands on. Keep your eyes open and read what you sign and what your loved ones sign, because trust without attention is just a nicer name for negligence. And when the day comes that doing right means losing something you love, find it in yourself to do it anyway. I lost my daughter. I won't pretend that doesn't sit on my chest some mornings. But I kept the one thing she was counting on me to surrender without a fight, and that was my own self-respect. Eileen would have wanted me to keep it. I think, if she's anywhere, she's glad I did.